Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. I realize it's the end of the day. You're probably tired. I'm going to try and make it interesting, keep you up and awake. My name is Ilan Medjar. I'm with XLM Solutions. We're a SolidWorks certified service partner as well as a software partner. We mainly focus on PDM and PLM implementations. Obviously, EPDM is one of them, but also some of the other Dassault platforms like SmartTeam, Innovia Suite, if you know, etc. One of our core competencies is develop custom applications and solutions around EPDM, as well as advanced data models. So whether it's basic quick starts or if you have a more industry-oriented requirements, we can work with you. We really understand the business side of things as well as the technical side of things. A little bit about what I'm going to talk about today, quick overview. For the most part, this is going to be a technical and presentation, quite a few examples, but we'll start the discussions about customization, more of implementation aspect. What, why, and when would you consider to customize your system? We'll cycle back to this discussion when we get to the end. We'll talk about additional tips and implementation consideration. We'll go through an ROI example, an ROI calculator that will be available for you when we're done with all the, after we get more technical. After I'll talk a little bit about the customization, I'll go through the different EPDM customization options. The way I'm going to do it is I'll basically demonstrate the functions or the different options. I'll discuss or bring up use cases where I think these functions can be used, where I've seen it used, as well as look at the configuration and the setup behind. But really throughout the implementation, I'll address implementation points, tips that are a little bit more advanced. So whether you're a novice, intermediate, or advanced, I think there's going to be some useful discussion points and some useful demos. If you are familiar with some of the topics, then please sit tight and patiently. I'm sure you'll find some of the other more advanced discussion points useful to your implementation. So we'll go over some of those options. We'll touch a little bit the data cards, some tips for designing cards, and more advanced functions. Again, some of you might be familiar with that portion. However, oftentimes I find that these topics are not well covered during training, and system administrators and sometimes even implementers do not take advantage of these cards design and functions. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about normalizing your cards, and we'll go through some formulas, etc. I'll then talk about the dispatch tool, which is probably a subject for an entire session, but I'll give you an overview. We'll go through an example, possible setups, etc. We'll talk about more advanced customization options normally associated with programming, although this is not going to be an API or a programming session. So for those of you that think this is a little bit about them, this is not going to be an admin or code session, although I'll give some tips for developers as well as for system administrators. So whether you're the consumer of the customization, whether you're the client or the implementant or both of them, there's going to be some useful points I'll bring up. So we'll talk about add-ins, event-based add-ins. What are the events? The importance of understanding the events. How to set up an add-in in the system, and some tips for, again, some more technical tips for designing an add-in. We'll also talk about tasks, out-of-the-box tasks, as well as the ability to customize tasks, and the use of standalone executable. And again, the way I'm going to do it, I'll demonstrate it, discuss possible use cases where I've seen it used, and go through the setup behind, as well as address implementation consideration around it. We'll then go and review debugging, the importance of debugging and testing. How do you debug these things, as well as the importance of test environment and recommendation for testing methodologies. And we'll conclude with some additional implementation tips, as well as an ROI calculator that you can use to justify some of those customization. And then I'll conclude and answer any questions. If you feel that there's any topic here that you'd like to further discuss that is related to your implementation, but you have specific question to your EPDM implementation, and we can do it, if not today, we have a booth, 1144, one of those small kiosk booths at the Partner Pavilion. My partners, Mark, John, and I will be there. If you have anything you've seen here and you want to discuss in more related to your specific implementation, I'll be more than happy to have further discussions tomorrow or after this session. Okay, so let's talk about, before we get technical, let's talk about a little bit what, why, and when, and we'll get back to this later in the presentation. So first, just to put some things in order, configuration versus customization. So oftentimes I would talk to different customers, different implementers, people come from different PDM backgrounds. They kind of confuse the word configuration versus customization. So for the sake of this presentation, just so everyone is on the same page, when I'm referring to configuration or customization by configuration, I'm basically, it means using the out-of-the-box tools. So this is where you're going to use the workflow editor as part of the administration tool, creation of templates, variables. For the most part in this presentation, I'm not going to cover most of those topics for the simple reason that A, they're well covered during training. There's really that much that you can do with them. It's fairly intuitive tools. However, I will address some of the cards function, like I mentioned before, because I think that a lot of implementers and system administrators fail to use some of those functions. So pretty much, as far as configuration goes, we'll only address advanced card configuration. Customization, this is where we're talking about mainly some level of programming involved, or using the dispatch tool. We'll talk about this later as part of this presentation. Dispatch is kind of a hybrid because it's available out of the box, but it allows you to basically write or create action and functions, program-like functions, without being really a developer. So we'll talk about that, as well as the add-ins, the tasks, etc. So why would you need customization? And I guess that's the easiest question to answer. This is whenever there's the out-of-the-box tool, the administration tool, and the functions are not comprehensive enough. Basically, you need to implement a certain business or use case in the system. You consult it with your implementer, and you figure out that A, it's either impossible, or B, it's possible, but it takes extra 3 right clicks or whatever. The process becomes tedious, not efficient. That's an easy candidate for customization. The more difficult question to answer is when would you implement customization? And unfortunately, there's no magic formula here. There's multiple variable. You all know there's budget constraints, organizational culture. Certain users in an organization like to see things in a certain way. They used to have a legacy system that work in a system way. So there's really a lot of variables. But these are the first 2 tips, and I'll give you a few more tips during the presentation, I'm sorry. The first tip is if you have any business mission or mission critical business requirement, that may be a given. For example, if you need to migrate legacy data because you won't be able to work with live data in the system once you start working with DPDM, there's really no choice. It's a requirement. It normally weighs more than budget restriction because you got to have the data in the system. If you need to integrate with an ERP system, for example, or an MR or a PLM system, and I'm not necessarily saying in phase 1, but at some point in your implementation, that's a business requirement. You used to do it in a previous system, or it's your corporate requirement. That's kind of a given. At some point in our implementation, it would be nice to have some sort of communication with the enterprise system. So that's a mission critical business requirement. That's an easy justification for customization. And then there's all those small, nice, and elegant enhancement where an ROI, we'll talk about an ROI, we'll see an ROI calculated at the end of the presentation, can help you make the justification to justify customization. This is normally measured by time saved using the automation. So if it saves an engineer or a designer 5 minutes a day, X amount of days per year, X amount of engineer in the company, you can quantify it by hours, dollar amount, etc. If it's a high number, you have high ROI, and we'll see that later on when we go to that calculator. That's a good indicator that you may need to customize a specific business process. At the same time, one of my rule of thumbs that when I basically talk to novice or even intermediate system administrator or system owners, don't rush to customize. Try to phase it out if possible. Make sure that you're at a maturity level of understanding the system before you implement any customization, for the simple reason that when you really don't know what you don't know. And oftentimes I work with system administrators as customers that were insisted on implementing certain customization because they used to have it in the previous system or they envisioned it working in a certain way. And a couple of months after, they would come to me and say, hey, we could either do it differently, we could have done it more efficiently, and in some cases even, we could have done an extra right click without this entire customization. So you waste your time, put effort into testing, writing requirements and whatnot, just to realize that you could have done it better, and then there's more cycle back and forth with your implementer. So try to phase it out or wait with it a little bit. Now, that could be 2 weeks into production, that could be 2 months in production, that could even be before production if you had a couple of months to play with the system, really understand the architecture, the different customization options, okay? And we'll talk about more tips, both technical and implementation related through this entire presentation. Okay, so now we get to where we talk about configuring data cards. And again, I'm sure this is more where probably the target audience would be the novice to intermediate. We'll go over input formulas. They allow basically to do simple string and numeric manipulations with variables on cards. We'll review the control logic, hiding and graying out fields, and what would be a possible use case for that, as well as how to set it up. We'll talk about control tabs by variables and where could this be useful, and cascaded list or dependent list. This is where you have multi-level of categories. So you pick one category and then you want to drive the values in another subcategory variable based on whatever you picked in the first list. If you are familiar with some of those functions, that's great. Please wait patiently. I'm sure the other topics will provide some additional new useful information. So let's go into, there's going to be a lot of small demos and setup. Let's go through some of the examples. And hopefully I'm not going to have any resolution issues here. Okay, let me bring up my EPDM. Okay. I'm just going to check out this part. Okay. Just so that I can go through the demo. And I'm going to use this demo tab here. So the first function, perhaps the most basic one, some of you might be familiar with it, is simply concatenating variables or into a single variable. So look at the title 1 and title 2 variables here and the description field as I type. You can ignore what's going on here. I'll explain this later. So that's the most basic and probably not very advanced function. So if I type, let's say, military, standard, whatever, just some numbers. And notice that the description is being populated, and then I'm going to add here, whatever, example. Okay, so you can see that the two fields are concatenated together. Now, where is this useful? There are two useful use cases that I've seen this used when working with multiple customers. First case, for example, when we're talking about title block, mapping for title blocks. If you have a drawing and you're restricted with the length of the characters on your title block, so you have more than one line for description or title, for example, and I just recently worked with a customer. He didn't want to go through the hassle of changing all these templates. There also, he wasn't the only group, his group wasn't the only group in the organization that used the templates, so he didn't want to go through the hassle of changing his title block templates in SolidWorks. So he needed to be able to map two different title fields into the title block at the same time from an EPDM standpoint, and we'll talk about this in one of the next slides when we talk about normalizing cards, sort of tips to make cards more efficient and better performance. He needed a single field for users to basically search for the data. Because if you have two different fields, and let's say we didn't have this description here, it was only title 1 and title 2, every search, basically you have double the amount of time for searching. Because you don't know if the military, this MIL, is in title 1 or title 2. So if a user needs to search for a certain word, he has to search by two fields, title 1 and title 2. And obviously that's not a good implementation, right? You want to minimize the amount of redundant data. So his solution, which I'm not saying it's the best, but I've seen it more than once used, he concatenated the data, made this read-only. Users were trained to use only the description, but at the same time, he was able to map without changing anything in SolidWorks and going through, impact other users, et cetera, in communities in his organization. He was able to map these to the drawing, to the file, yet leave this for searches in EPDM. Okay, and again, the ultimate solution would be not to have those two title lines. He had a constraint. He couldn't change. He didn't want to go through the hassle because there were other groups involved and whatever. So he solved it this way, and I've seen more than one customer use it. Another possible good use case for this is pretty much for all the string function templates. Those of you who have been using EPDM templates know that in many cases, if you use a template with a card, the user is prompted for input, you might need to do some manipulation. For example, you want to remove the prefix and then use the rest as a file name or something like that. This is where type of string function, not necessarily this one, but this one as well, will be very useful. So for advanced EPDM templates where there's user input involved, you don't want to use coding to extract file name or remove prefixes, add prefixes. You want to add two values and drive it as the file name or something like that. Very good use for card functions. Did you have a question, Leroy?
Could you use it to filter out a character, like a carriage return?
I'm not, this is a good question. I've never tested it. There's a find. One of the functions is a find. I don't know if it could, I don't believe it can take a carriage return, but I'll have to get back to you. That's a good question. I've never used it with a carriage return. Okay, so if you want, I'll get back, give me your card or something, I'll get back to you. This one's a good question, okay? So how do we set this up very quickly for those of you who are fairly new to EPDM? If I click on this, again, go to my demo tab, on the description, notice that there is an input formula here. Those of you who never used the formula before, you can open it in a separate editor by clicking on these three buttons. But basically, if I click on this arrow here, you can see that you can basically pick any variables to concatenate. It could be more than two. So in my case, if I had to redo it again quickly, all I have to do is I need title 1. So I'm going to pick title 1. I can put space, comma, whatever delimiter. It's up to me. And put title 2 as well. So that's all I had to do, and save it, and that's it. Okay, that's probably the easiest function. Okay. Some of the, before I demo some other functions, if I click on the functions themselves, you can see there's a couple numeric, this is at the top mainly, numeric manipulation. This part in the middle is mainly string, and then you have some static ones like today's date. This could be useful, again, in templates, workflow, etc. So let's quickly go over a couple of other examples. This is a case of, if you notice that when I typed the military standard 1939, again, this value appeared here, only the last 4 characters. Where is this useful? Mainly templates. This is where I've seen this used. If you have templates with data card input, you need to remove a prefix and use the rest as a file name or feed that into a different variable. Again, those of you who try to work with more advanced templates with cards, know that in some cases you want to make manipulation. If you don't have the coding option, input formulas could do some of the job. You can hide variable and make some calculation and then use it as file name, etc. So templates is a very good use case to use this type of configuration. Now, how do we do that quickly? This is a case where this is my substring. I use the write. This is one of the string formulas. If I want to do it again, so basically I'm taking the last 4 characters out of the title field. How do I do that? Very quickly, it's very simple. I pick the function. I want the right function. I can do the left, right, etc. Right. This is just a template, so I need to replace this with a field. And I also want 4 characters, not 3. So I'm just going to delete that. Go to the variables. Pick the title 1 field. This is the field I want to basically sort of truncate or take the right foremost characters, and comma 4. Okay, so I have this now. This will give me the last 4 characters. Again, very useful in more advanced templates when you don't have other programming customization option. A quick numeric example, cost. Let's say this costs $100, and I have 5 of those. Notice that this calculates the total. Perhaps costing is not the best example where I've seen this used more often is conversions. You want to convert from inches to feet, from length, width to square dimension, material stocking, so you go from length to number of pipes, things of that sort. That's where I've seen it used, but I had some customer way back in the past when PLM systems were not as robust as today that used it also for costing, although probably conversion is a better use case for using numeric manipulation. A quick review of the setup here. Again, if I look at the total, I can see that I'm using one of the numeric function, multiply cost by quantity. I'll very quickly show that. I think you got the point, but I picked the function multiply. It just puts some hard numbers there. I can remove it, and I need to multiply the cost by quantity. So I'm going to pick cost by comma and then my quantity, which variables. Here we go. Okay, this is pretty much all I did here. Okay, so this is really, it gives you a sense of how can you use it more advanced functions. Like I said, if you have conversion, you'll use numeric. If it's any of the string manipulation, then this is, for example, related to mapping or more advanced templates where you have data cards that you want to manipulate or extract some values to drive a file name or something like that without having programming skills. Okay. So let me go back and talk about some other card functions, but not related to string or numeric manipulation. Next thing I want to show is the ability to hide or gray out controls based in certain cases. Okay, so in this case, notice that the manufactured part is unchecked. So basically, this is a purchase part. This is why the cost shows on the card. But if I click on this manufactured part, basically it's in-house developed, manufactured. I'm not interested in seeing cost or total for this file. Okay, so this is one example. Obviously, there's multiple to hide this control. Where could this be useful? And again, we'll talk about this in one of next couple slides. Normalizing your cards for efficiency and performance. But basically, if you want to minimize the amount of cards designed in your system, basically not have too many cards. We'll talk about why in a couple slides. But it mainly has to do with efficiency, performance, and usability. This is one way to do it. So I can use the same card. The users are familiar with it, so it's more efficient. Yet I can choose to show or hide certain fields based on some logic. Okay, in this case, whether it's a purchase or not. So how do we set that up real quick? If I go back to my design, this is my manufacturer part. The field, the variable here is outsourced. And basically, I want to control it so that whenever this is checked, this label and this text control and this label and this text control are hidden. How do I do that? I have to go to each one of those four controls, the text and the labels, go to the control menu, control logic, and you can see I can either hide it. You can pick basically an action, whether to hide or gray out. I pick to hide it. And the condition is whenever this checkbox, whenever the outsource variable equals 1 or checked, in other words, checked, basically hide this control. And I basically did the same for the labels and the text controls. Okay? So that, again, hiding controls. The main benefit, using less cards in your system, it's better performance. Users are more familiar with the cards, easier to get oriented, so it's more efficient also. And we'll talk about this in a couple of slides, the reason for that. Okay. The next card-related function I want to show, let me just undo checkout here because I need this file for other stuff, so I don't want to change here. I'll use another file, for example. I'm going to pick this specification file. It's an office document. Let me just check it out quickly. There's a couple more functions before we go to the more advanced and technical topics. Checkout. Okay. So the next topic I want to talk about is control tabs. So first let me demonstrate it, and then I'll mention where I've seen it used and how to set it up briefly. So notice that I have this document type list, and I have different type of document types. So this is basically an Office document, a docx, might be any one of these data types. Okay, I want to distinguish data types. And let's say if I pick a software, for example, document, I need additional information specific relevant to software, such as executable, the binary name. Okay, you have some electrical components, you want to put it in. However, if this is a procedure document, I don't want to see the software related information. I want to see this procedure specific related information. So I want to be able to pick one of those procedures. Okay. So before we see how we set it up, let's talk about use cases. So the best use case here is, for example, again, normalizing cards. If you want to use, instead of the maintenance, the headache of creating different cards for each one of the type, instead of going and say software is card A, procedure is card B, you can basically use a single card, because a lot of the fields are common, and just distinguish specific information based on this document type. Okay, so it saves you the headache of administration, creating multiple cards. Users are more familiar with the cards because it's a single card in the system. It's also performance-wise better in EPDM in most cases. There's some exceptions. And again, we'll talk about those tips later on. So basically, by using this mechanism, I can control. I can say the card that is associated, which is associated with the Office docx file, could basically be any of the document type, and then I can show only the relevant information. How do you set it up? If I go back to my card, let me just open my the Office card here real quick. So this is the document type, the controlling variable. I noticed that there's a tab control here at the bottom. It wasn't visible before, but it was there. It's on the card. Okay. Now the trick to make this work, when I click on the card here, I have to specify a controlled by variable. In my case, this tab control is controlled by the document type. So it means that basically I can control what tab is presented based on the pick from this list. Now the trick is here, you have to have the same list of tabs in the same order and exact names, what you see here, as in the document type list, whether it's a free list or an EPDM list. Okay? As long as you maintain the same list here, you can basically make it so that if I pick, let's say, software document type, okay, the software here will be presented. Okay. Now the trick of having this blank tab here and the initial value here is blank is just so that when I initially present it as blank, I don't want to see anything. However, if I select the software like I just demonstrated, it will show me the relevant fields on the software tab. Okay. So if I go back real quick to the card, you can see that on the software tab, I'm presenting something specific only to the software. If I'm going with the procedure, I'll see another variable relevant only to the procedure. Okay, so again, just to summarize, this is a good use case where you want to use a single card for all possible data types that are basically saved as a Word document, whether it's a spec, work instruction, ECO, whatever the docx file is. Okay. And then the last function I want to show is the cascaded list. Okay, so just as we just talked about the tab, we can do the same when we have dependent lists. So in the case of a software, okay, if I present the list here, I want to see a set of specific subcategories picked. So if I pick software, I want to be able to specify subcategory that is relevant to software. Okay, if I specify a procedure or work instruction, I want to see different values here in the subcategory. Okay, so again, the business case or the use case here is identical to the one before, minimizing cards. A single doc card in EPDM is associated to multiple data types. You don't have to go through the headache of maintenance of creating different cards. Okay, how to do that quickly before we go to the more advanced option. So basically, if I pick the subcategory field, again, I specify that it's controlled by a variable. Okay. If I click on the details, you can tell that the controlling variable is the document type. It's the first one. Okay. Now, for each value that I have in the document type, in this case, I only implemented 2. Remember, I had more tabs, but you don't have to implement all of them. So if it's a procedure, I want to show the relevant list in EPDM, the procedures list. If I pick software in the document type, I want to show the list of software options in EPDM. Now, this can go till n levels. I showed an example with 2 levels. It can go to 3 levels or more, but if your lists are long, I can tell you right now, it's a tedious process. It takes a while. If you have short lists, you can easily take it to the 3rd or 4th level. But again, very useful, a lot of time used on a 2 control level. Like I said, cascaded dependent lists, basically. Okay, so let's go back to our presentation. I'm just going to undo the checkout because I'm going to use this one for some more advanced examples when we discuss some of the next topics. Okay. Okay. So we talked about input formulas, string and numeric manipulation. This is either good for the mapping example I was talking about with title blocks, advanced templates when you have cards and you want to sort of remove prefixes and drive file names and whatnot, as well as conversion when we talk about numeric functions. Control logic, this was the checkbox. You can hide control based on a certain business logic. This is good for better usability, performance, etc. And dependent lists and control tabs. This is when you want to minimize the amount of administration, the amount of cards associated to a file extension in EPDM. You can use these 2 options. So you have 1 card, but you can still differentiate based on different data types. Okay. A couple comments in general about defining data cards. This will conclude the section that talks about out-of-the-box configurations. So basically, normalizing data card. Normalizing comes, I borrowed it from a database terminology. And those of you who are not familiar with databases, it's fine. I can replace it by simply saying simplifying. Okay? These are some tips for designing cards. They are not always true. There's a lot of exceptions, but it's guidelines or recommendation that if you can, try to follow. So some objectives or things that I would recommend. First of all, eliminating redundant data. More than once, I'd work with a customer and I'd see description 1, 2, or description 1, or titles, because like I said, they didn't use my recommendation previously in the demo. They had 2 different title lines on the title block, or for whatever the reason. This is obviously not recommended. Why? A, it doubles the amount of searches. And searches is one of the most common operation that an engineer or user would do in the system, right? If you have 2 description line, how can you tell if you're searching for a certain word? How do you know if it's in description 1 or 2? So technically, you have to do twice the amount of searches in the system. If you have 3 fields like that, you have to do 3 times the amount of searches. And it rolls up, it adds up, and this could be a usability and efficiency issue. So try to minimize it if possible. If you have to leave it because you need to do the mapping, try to use some of the tricks that I showed before with concatenating the values into a single search string so the users in the system can rely on one variable for searching. Okay? Otherwise, it's just a tedious process. The user will be annoyed. I have to search for the 3 fields because I'm not sure where that word is located. So minimize the amount of redundant variables. Okay? Store the data in the right place. Okay? So I'm giving the example of project number. This could be material, could be ECO. We'll look into that later on. There's an example I can better explain, but try to avoid keeping the same information in more than one location for 2 reasons. A, there's a good chance that basically, I guess the key reason for that is in data integrity. If you put it in multiple places, it means that in one place a user can change it, whether it's on the folder but not on the file, or in one file but not on another. And then you have a data integrity issue. Basically, now you change the picture. That wasn't the intent of the initial design. So A, you can jeopardize data integrity. B, you can try and put some tight controls. So let's say if it's a variable that is inherited from a folder, it will be read only on the card. But then A, you add more administration, so it's a little bit of headache. And B, again, you constrain some user functionality, such as updating certain numbers and whatnot. Other things that I wouldn't recommend is, for example, if you have, again, a project number or ECOs or materials that are used on more than one part, I've seen really weird cases where customers just started concatenating all the values into one text string, or doing weird things such as allocating variable, material 1, 2, 3, 4, just to have a placeholder for the different materials or project numbers or whatnot in case a part is used across multiple projects, or if we're talking about example of material, there's more than, part could in theory be built for more than one material and whatnot. So all these things basically make the user's life a lot more difficult. So really try to put data in a single location as much as possible. One of my recommendations, for example, is whenever you have a data that is associated with more than one file, use links or paste as reference. Some users are intimidated by it, but really it's the same amount of steps. We'll see that in the add-in example. Same amount of steps, a lot, easy. I think easier at the end of the day, and definitely maintains data integrity. It's much easier to break a snapshot when you use links, and I'll show a demonstration of a link for those of you who are not familiar with it when we go through some of the add-in examples. So again, the goals here to make the cards more efficient, reduce search time, for example. The more duplicate or redundant data that you have, the more search and headache for the users, or more administration if you want to restrict that, and then also data integrity. If you have data in more than one location, there's a good chance that a user, intentionally or not, will change in one location but not in other places, and then the update, doesn't matter how disciplined he or she is, there's a risk. So again, try to follow these rules if possible. That's not always the case, but these are good guidelines to follow. Okay, so that kind of concluded the discussion about the cards, tips, and functions. Let's talk about a little bit more advanced, kind of incremented one level topic, the dispatch. I know some of you there was another session about dispatch or hands-on session. But basically, the dispatch is an add-in or a tool. It comes out of the box. You can choose to install it as part of the out-of-the-box vault. If you chose not to add it, you can always import it later on. It's under the install directory of EPDM, so it can always be added later. Basically, it provides the ability to add customized functionality without in-depth programming capability. You don't have to be a developer to add certain actions and automate functions in the system. And you don't have to have Visual Studio, Microsoft, all those tools, development tools. Okay? Overall, for the task and function that the dispatch is good for, there's less effort involved. Obviously, less cost if you need a consultant to do it. But if you can do it yourself, there's less effort involved compared to programming. Okay. And again, the exception here or the rule is that this is only good for specific function. The cons is that it doesn't have rich functionality as programming. So certain comprehensive solutions you can't use the dispatch for. I mean, and if you can, it's going to be way more complicated than using an add-in. So some things you can avoid using programming. Okay. So let's look at an example and the setup behind and some options that you can use in the dispatch. The example will be a menu command to copy a file from EPDM to an outside directory and rename the file. This could just as well be a change state event that will do the same thing. Okay. So let me get out of the presentation. And first, I'll demonstrate the functionality, and then I'll go through the actual setup behind. So again, I'm going to pick this document, and notice that I have this custom menu here, edited by the dispatch. Clicked on it, it shows an operation completed, and I'll show you this file, and later on that it was created. It's outside my vault, it's on my configured to go to the ctemp. If I open my ctemp, so I have this weird file here that says 1_admin_specification. We'll see why it comes out this way, okay? So a little bit about the setup and the configuration, what you can do with the dispatch. So again, dispatch comes out of the box. It's a SolidWorks developed tool. That's why it says SolidWorks Corporation. Once you configure it or import it, you can do a right click here, and this is your action editor. Click on the action editor, and this dispatch. Right now, it shows that I only have one action that I configure, or one program. You can add, remove, load from another database. So let's dig in here and dive into the setup of the function. So basically, at the top, you see the name. This is what and description. This is what the user sees. In my case, it's a command. It's a command, but you have option. You can either define it as a command action. It could be a change state. So whenever you do a certain change state, it could be a combination. It can run. You can tell it to run either manually as a command, like a right click, or whenever you change certain state. So you see also some other action, like on the checkout of the file, you can run some operation to add data to the cart, for example, etc., or during add file. Okay. In my case, I just pick the command. Again, if you pick change state, for example, it allows you to specify what is the target state. So when I change something to what state, and I'm not going to go through that level of technical level, but in this, had I used this example here, it would basically anything under the project folder that is a bitmap, whenever I change state to this state, it will trigger the add-in. Okay? And then you have the different actions. You can use variables. This is where some background in programming, you don't have to be a developer, but understanding concept of programming like loops and variables would be helpful. If not, it's a very quick, in 1 hour I can explain to you how these things work. It's like basically variable like in a math equation, okay? So you can go and add functions. In my case, I basically did a for loop. Basically, if I select more than one document, it will loop through all of them and perform the copy. We'll end the operation for all document and we'll show an OK message. Okay, very basic command. Some commands like the copy, I can add some variables. So if I go to the edit here, you can see that I basically said, without going too deep technically, I use some of the out-of-the-box variable that says the selected file, the one that was selected when I did the right-click, copy to ctemp, current version of file. That's what you saw, if you remember on the temp, you saw 1_admin. The name, again, these are all internal available variables that you can pick from this list. So I basically chose to rename it using the version, the current version, _ the user, _ the original file name. That's why you saw this weird name here. The 1_admin _ specification. The original file name was specification. So I don't want to confuse it too much, but you see there's some out-of-the-box variables that you can use to define. You can pick file name or the folder where the current file is selected and whatnot. There's a bunch of fairly intuitive variables that are available out there for you. Okay. Some other actions. I just showed an example of a copy. Some other actions or commands that you may use when you run a dispatch action. You can check in a file. You can check out, check in. You can, obviously there's the loop option if you want to run this on more than one document, get a file, change state, run an external application, and it can get more technical and more detailed. You can update variables. So you have, for instance, you can, it doesn't really matter, but you can use some of those functions, actually the edit box to get feedback from user and then populate it into a card. This is where probably programming is a better fit, okay? I'm not saying it's not doable here. If you absolutely need it, you don't have the budget, you can do some nice things, but it's a little bit more of a headache, and you really need some understanding of programming here, even though you're not a programmer, okay? But very good use tool. I've seen it used by, for instance, resellers or people that don't have technical knowledge to do batch transitions of workflow. So you migrate some data, you want to move it from one state to another as a bulk, things like that. This is where running dispatch without being a developer, you might not need your implementer to do it. I mean, if you don't have the development skills, you as administrator can quickly learn this tool and use it for these cases. A quick update or some batch operations. Okay. Okay. So let's go back to the presentation. So that was the dispatch. Again, it's an out-of-the-box tool, but it allows you to create action, programming-like action without having development skill. This is where we're going to talk about more advanced options. Don't be alarmed. It's not, again, like I said, it's not going to be an API training, but I think whether you're an admin, an implementer, a developer, or a novice user, you'll find some important points to these discussions. We'll also show an example of automating an ECO or ECN. It's not like the one that is out there, the basic one. It's a little bit more advanced. It will be available for you at the end of the presentation if you want to use it. It's a proof of concept, but it works, and you can use it if you want, if you have the skills or if you have an implementer that you work with. It's going to be available on our website. We'll see that in a minute. So that's going to be an interesting example. Okay, advanced customization option. This is where we talk about add-ins, event-based add-ins, tasks, and standalone executable. Okay. So first of all, EPDM has provided a robust SDK, software development kit, APIs list, can be developed in different .NET tools, and there's very good documentation compared to most PDMs that I work with in the past. Now this is more for the system administrators. Okay, these are some myths that whenever we talk to, when we identify a need to customize for customization, this is typically what we would get the answer from the admin. I don't need or customize, whether it's budgeting. And it's typically due to one of those myths here that I specify. It's either we're concerned about problems with upgrades, compatibility uses, what will happen, it will break the system, and I have to change it every upgrade. Increased complexity, I now have to go and install stuff on clients, I don't need this headache. And then the last thing is, if you add an add-in, something breaks, now the system is not supported, SolidWorks is not going to help me. Okay? So basically, the facts are, and I'm trying to disprove pretty much each one of the myths here. So the facts are the following. First of all, many EPDM customers have implemented customization. I can tell that 90% of my time is probably, and my colleagues' time, is implementing customization. Okay, programming, advanced configuration, not necessarily code, but a lot of code. Okay, the APIs are largely compatible across version. So the way they develop their, and again, I don't want to go too technical, the way they develop their libraries, their objects, is so that everything is backward compatible. If, let's say, there was some functions to manipulate a file, and the next release of SolidWorks, they want to enhance it and add additional functions, they will never change the existing library. So anything you had in your original custom code or whatever is still going to work. Okay? If they want to add new functionality, let's say rename didn't exist in 2005, they added it in 2006, they will create another library, inherit everything that was in the previous one, and implement a new one. So whatever you implemented before, basically, will not break. They'll always add a new one. So there's really no fear, and I can tell you, the past 6 or 7 years I've been customizing EPDM, there was one change where the logic didn't change. There was a change, Microsoft changed technologies for COM to .NET, and again, without getting too technical, the PDM, and not just EPDM, had to catch up, and so there was minor changes. But that's once out of like 7 years. Okay, so that's really not a valid concern. Properly constructed add-ins are easy to deploy and maintain. Basically, the way you're forced to write an add-in makes the deploy very easy. You don't have to go and install anything on any client machine. You don't have to do silent install, do it at the end of the day. Basically, once the administrator adds the add-in to the system, the next time the user restarts, or the next time the user restarts his Windows Explorer, that's it. Voila. The add-in works, the customization is implemented. So no really, very minimal, if not basically no effort almost involved in distributing and deploying add-ins. As far as troubleshooting or any concern with support, an add-in can very easily, and I'll show that in a minute when I go through the demo, can very easily be added or removed from the system. So if SolidWorks wants to test the performance issue and you're not sure if it's the custom function that someone developed for you or out-of-the-box function, very easily remove it. Normally you'll do that in a test environment. Remove the add-in. Whenever you're done, SolidWorks is done with their test, add it back in. I'll show you how to do that. Very simple. Okay, so again, it's always going to be supported basically. And then there's cases really when there's no other choice. For example, we often do migrations from other legacy system. Almost always, except maybe Workgroup. If some of you are using Workgroup, that's the only exception probably. You have to use customization because EPDM and any other PDM or PLM system will never have all the adapters for all the legacy system in the world. So in some cases, whether you like it or not, there's almost no way to avoid it. Okay? Now, there's a challenge. I've worked with quite a few administrators that once they realized the value of administration, they were a little bit, went overboard. Let's do this, let's do that, this looks nicer. Just because you can do it doesn't mean that you have to make everything fancy. Obviously, there's a cost to it, but this goes back to my initial recommendation. Don't go overboard and don't rush with customization, basically, okay? Not because of any of the myths here, simply because, A, there's cost to it, and if something works well without it, then why having it? So, okay. So, very brief, again, for those of you who are not very technical, news for you. This actually some of the information that you'll see in this card, even if you're not a developer, if you're simply a system administrator, this is some very important information for you. So An add-in can be added on almost every event in EPDM. You can see some of the events here on the right. I'll go over those in a minute because these are very important. It runs on the computer that performs the event, so it runs on your client. It's not a server or anything like that, okay? Depending on the event, different information is provided to the add-in, okay? For example, if a file was not yet added, meaning it's a before add event, so I might have the path and whatnot, but I'm not going to have some database information because it's not yet in the system. Once it's added, I have internal information such as IDs and additional information because it's already in the database. So this is a little bit technical, but this part here is really where it's really important. If you're a system administrator or a power user or a consumer of a customization, I strongly recommend that you get familiar with this concept. Sit with your consultant, read the administration book. You don't have to be a developer. I can tell you that it is by far more efficient and easier to work with as an implementer, with an administrator that is well familiar with the architecture and understand the event-based mechanism than with someone that just, here's the requirements, do whatever you want with it, for multiple reasons. I mean, and I can tell you, there's a lot of, the requirements are better defined, so the overall process of implementing this customization is shorter and more efficient, a lot less back and forth between the implementer and the consumer, the system administrator. And also, in many cases, there's more than one option, like anything else in EPDM or any configurable system, there's more than one option to do something. And I can tell you from my experience, oftentimes I'd be locked on a specific path, a certain way, but I don't really know the organization, I don't know the users, I don't know, I may understand the use case, but A, there's maybe more than one way to do it, and B, I don't know your users and what their preferences are. If you as an admin are familiar with a different option, you can save that, extra development. I can develop something, give it, deliver, test, and then you'll come back saying, no, that's not really what I envisioned. Okay, I have to go back and forth. A knowledgeable administrator, I can tell you, this is by far less involved. Now, if it's a basic add-in, updated variable, not a big deal. But if you're looking at a more comprehensive, let's say the ECO solution the proof of concept that I'm going to demonstrate soon, this is where it will be beneficial if you know the different option. Do I want this as a menu click, or what does it mean if I do it as a before or after change state? Okay, this is really something that can easily be, you can get trained on. It takes about an hour. Very simple concept. For example, I'll give you a few things that why would it be important for you to know that? Obviously, the implementer should know what he's doing and let you know the different options and whatnot. But it's always better if you know it as well. The pre and post event. Okay, let me just see what time. Okay. For example, the pre and post event, obviously pre is before the operation takes place, before add, before change state, and post is after it happens. Why is this important, for example? So, simple example, you want to add a file and check it in, and you want to validate that certain values were entered by the user. If it's, excuse me, if it wasn't entered, warn the user and abort the adding. That's an easy case, easy example for a pre-event, right? You want to do it before the file is added to the system. You want to validate that the right information was added. Post-event is good for scenarios where once the data is already in the system, I want to do some automatic manipulation on what was entered already, okay? Another common event that we use a lot in programming is before and after change state. This is perhaps the most confusing event for administrators, okay? For example, pre means that any event, if you ask your implementer, listen, I need a certain operation that would happen on a change state. If it happens on the pre-event, it means that I'm still on the original state. I haven't changed the state yet. So permission, revision scheme, everything is derived from the original state. If I'm writing a post-event, everything is derived from the transition already happened. Okay, so any version updates, anything that's going to happen is going to happen once the transition has been completed. Whereas that could be confusing. For example, and I hope I'm not going to confuse some of you, but let's say you have two states, pending review or pending approval and approved. And in between you have a transition that actually increments a revision. If you're going to implement a post event, meaning once the transition is implemented, it's already in the release state, and you only then want to implement, let's say, update a variable, basically in your history, you'll see Rev A or B, whatever the increment revision went to, and then you'll see another version where the update actually takes place. And oftentimes, users or administrators don't realize that. And then we'll write a script, they'll ask us to do it post-event, but then they say, wait a minute, I don't see the actual update on the revision itself, I see it as a new version. It's very confusing. And then we have to change the code, et cetera, et cetera. So this is where really basic review of some of the guides without being a developer could save you time if you're looking, if you work with your implementer and you want to implement some of those, use those events for customization, okay? Some quick technical, a little bit more technical information. If you're not familiar, I'll briefly review it. If you want to use an add-in, you have to create a class library in Visual Studio. You have to reference the EPDM, or it's still called PDMWorks behind the scene, but the EPDM libraries. You have to implement, it's just a process that you have to go through. If you're a developer, just copy this slide. You have to implement a certain interface. And then basically there are two functions or subroutines that you have to implement, the get end info and the on command. Okay, again, some technical information, just go through the process if you have some development skills. If not, just ignore this couple slides. So the get info, the first function that you have to implement, simply shows you what an admin sees when he registers the DLL. Some of the important items, when you work with your implementers, you see the version here, make sure that if they make any change, they increment it. So you can track the change and have some traceability on the changes, but anything you see here as an administrator is defined by code, version, name, etc. That's when you register the add-in, that's what you see. And then the other function is where you actually say, okay, this is what I wanted to do. I wanted to loop through the drawing that I selected and update a certain variable or whatever it is. Okay, so the on command is the subroutine where you actually do the work. Okay. So these are some tips for implementers, but also important for you as administrator to know if you work with an implementer, because oftentimes I had to go and fix some work that certain people did because it didn't work through some or didn't go through a checklist of guidelines and tips. Basically, everything that works for replication will work for a local machine, almost 90% of the cases. Okay, so if you implement and you write your code and the implementation from a design point and a code standpoint, for a replicated environment, it's going to work perfect or will get better performance both for the replication and the local side. However, that's not the other case. Oftentimes, I would come to a customer who tell me, listen, we wrote this add-in, it works great in the local side where the database is, but we have a replicated environment. The other side, it cripples the environment. As soon as we remove the add-in, great performance. Once we add the add-in, kills performance. So I'm not going to give the technical, this is a more detailed, advanced level, but there are considerations that when you work with an implementer or if you have in-house skills, make sure that you write it, assume that you have replication, and then you'll get better performance. Otherwise, it may very well work in the local main site, but have crippled the system in the replicating sites. Again, some more technical skills. Those of you who have some development skills, typically elegant code, you would do the declaration of variables and whatnot at the top. That's most books how they teach you, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the most efficient code. Okay, and again, this is a little bit more technical. So when we're talking about declare, initiate variables and call commands only when you need them. For example, if I want my add-in to only do some function on drawings, but I selected as an input, I selected drawings, I did a shift select of drawings and parts. The parts will be skipped. There's no point doing some initiation or whatever if I'm going to skip the parts. Why? Again, performance, if it's a replication, it's a lot of back and forth on the network. So really make sure that your in-house or your implementer knows what he's doing. Otherwise, especially in the case of replication, that's going to cripple your implementation, but it's a good guideline, okay? Use batch APIs. Again, there's a way to go file by file and do an update back and forth versus collect all the updates, push them once over the network. So if you can, not all business cases will allow you to use batch. Beware of integrated application. For example, a customer, I learned it the hard way. 6 years ago, I had a customer that used Visio, MS Visio, I think it was 2003, for hydraulic diagrams. And they were able to map properties to the diagram, but they didn't have the ability to have title blocks like AutoCAD or SolidWorks drawing has. And they needed me to develop, using the Visio blocks, a title block. Okay? I did it, great. The system admin tested. Next day in the morning, he calls me, listen, we had 25 or 30 engineers, works well, they're happy. Great. About a couple hours later, he calls me saying, listen, I have 8 other users, non-engineers, different profile organizations are using EPDM. They're getting those weird errors, .NET errors and whatnot. So obviously that was a lesson learned for me. there was some miscommunication. He failed to tell me that there are other user profiles. We'll talk about that when we talk about testing. Other user profiles are using the system and whatnot. So obviously, I had to change the code. I basically wrote the code originally so that it will basically look for Visio installed in the machine. And if Visio wasn't installed on the machine, there were some salespeople that entered some customer information. They didn't have Visio on the machine. Every time they add in pretty much every operation in EPDM, loaded the add-in couldn't find the Visio and start throwing those ugly exception. Again, I didn't know, was both lesson learned for me and the administrator of what not to do. And obviously, I changed the code. So if you're using things like Office, etc., be aware. That could be other application as well. If some users don't have it installed, that could be an issue, okay? This is, again, the last bulletin is probably more technical. If it's a .NET DLL, use any CPU, unless you're using a 32-bit application like Office, okay? Because then you have to build it dedicated in 32. But that's a little bit more technical. So let's look at an example. This example automates an ECO process using Excel. It will basically allow you to pick a set of drawings, generate an ECO, link the drawing to the ECO, populate the drawings information in the ECO all one operation, and then allow you to control the release of the drawings in context of the ECO. So by basically controlling the release of the drawings by releasing the ECO or as part of in context of the ECO process. So let's look at that. Close this. Okay, I'm going to use these two drawings. I'm going to do a right click. Notice that I have this initiate ECO. That's an add-in, okay, custom add-in. And basically what this add-in does behind the scene, it triggers an EPDM template that was designed by the system administrator to create an ECO, triggers the ECO, links the documents, and populate data into the ECO. So if I go to this ECO folder, this document was created. If I go to the contains, you can see that the document is linked to the two drawings. This is a good way to manage your data, okay? And so if you have one to n number of documents, instead of pushing the ECO onto the documents and all that stuff, it's easier to simply have one ECO, search for it, and then through the contain, get all the related drawing in this list or browse through them. That's, from a data integrity standpoint, that's a nice way to do it. But you can see that this automation created this link, also populated the information of the drawings into the ECO. So you see, the part, there were no revision, it's a new drawing, but part numbers or file name, whatever it was, admin information and description was populated. Okay, you don't have to do it manually. Why? Because if you do it manually, there's a chance that you'll do typos. You need to copy paste those links. This ECO process automated everything for you. In addition, if I go back to the ECO itself, if I right click here, notice that when I change a state and let's say sends the ECO to approval, I can control the change state of the drawing in one process. I don't have to do it separately, first release the drawing, then at some point advance the ECO. I can do it all at once. So if I push this ECO forward, it will push the drawing to the next step in the drawing approval. The way to do it, and again, this is more in the workflow configuration. It's not a part of the code, and I'll be happy to talk with anyone that is interested later in the application, is in one of two ways. Either make sure that in EPDM, the same workflow control the ECO documents and the drawings. Probably not the most realistic way, but doable. Because ECO is normally more involved, more disciplines and groups are involved in approving an ECO than a simple review of a drawing. So if the drawing workflow is different than the ECO, you can still make it work so that the ECO control the releases simply by ensuring that the transition name, at the point when you want to release the drawing, the transition name in the workflow is identical in both workflows. So let's say submit for approval. As long as you create that transition exactly in the same place in the two workflows, even if they're different, it will allow you to release the drawing in context of the ECO as one process. Okay? And this is not something I cover in this training, but I'll be happy to show you either later or tomorrow. Very easy configuration using the out-of-the-box workflow editor. Again, the code for this, if you want to use it as a baseline or you want to work with the implementer to sort of give them a kickstart, will be available on our website. I'll show it later. You can just send me an email to the contact. I've seen this in the demo. Can you share the code with us? It's a proof of concept. It's not super elegant, but it's a good start point. Okay, so that was about add-ins, I think. Yep. The next discussion point is about tasks. Okay. Tasks, the reason why the title says configuration and customization is because tasks, they're out of the box task add-in. I'll show those in a minute. Actually, give me 1 second here before I apologize. Before I jump to the task, for those of you who are a little bit more technical, just very briefly to show, if you remember, these are the main two functions that you have to cover. So as soon as basically you implement, you create your own add-in, you have to add the, this is the reference to the library of the EPDM with all the functions. You have to import it here. And again, this is mainly for developers. I'll very briefly review that. Implement the certain interface. Once you do that, it forces you to create two subroutines. One shows what you see in the admin tool. This is everything that you see in the admin tool. So if I go back to the admin tool and I have my custom add-in here, everything you see here is basically defined in this info. And this is loaded once when the add-in is loaded. And this is the how to do. Some tips for a developer. You might have an add-in with multiple functions. Don't just dump them here, all the functions. Very easy, difficult to read, and not useful. So if, let's say in my case, I only have one command, but I call another function that basically handle the command. That function first calls a template. This is a template, basically kicks off a template. This template is a template that was created by the system administrator. So we can go to the template here and even see that we have that template. That's the ECO template. So basically my function will create the template, will loop through the document, the selected document, get the information because I need to populate this inside the Excel, so we get some description, revision, whatever. And once I get all the information in memory, I basically call some Excel function here to update Excel, and at the end of the day, at the end of the add-in, I'm basically checking it back in. Okay, not super elegant proof of concept, but something you can use, or if you work with someone that has in-house skills, you can take advantage of this. So let's talk a little bit about tasks. Okay, tasks I think were introduced in 2010. The tasks feature in the administration tool lets you configure, run, and monitor tasks that are performed frequently on enterprise PDM files. Tasks are defined by add-ins created using the enterprise PDM APIs. Tasks can be queued up, run on separate computer, basically on some server. Basically, tasks are a form of a job server. Okay, just to simplify, you want to run a job on a remote server and not occupy the current client, you can use tasks. Okay. By the way, tomorrow afternoon, my colleague from XLA, Mark Young, will have its own session, not a long session, but a session about tasks dedicated for configuration and customization of tasks in more detail. So you're more than welcome to join his presentation tomorrow afternoon. This is just a high-level overview. Tomorrow is going to be a lot more technical, if anyone here is a little bit more technical. So the task feature, so like I said, there's some out-of-the-box tasks. For example, and I'm sure some of you have been using them, print or convert to PDF e-drawing, check design. There's like 3 different add-ins that are available out of the box. But you can customize your own tasks. Okay, so customized tasks can be created to handle other customer-specific tasks that should not run on the individual computer. For example, things that we've implemented to other customers, things that are not available out of the box. For instance, print or PDF and add some information about job IDs, adding watermarks. These are all things that are not available out of the box. If you need them, could be customized by code. Okay, this is just an example of things that we've done. Some batch reporting for management purposes that runs overnight or something. These are things that are not available out of the box, could be implemented as customized tasks, meaning through code. You still have to go through, basically use the resources of the way tasks are implemented in EPDM, but do that by code. Okay. So basically all aspects of the task can be configured. The setup, the admin side, so what the administrator sees. Okay, this is a case of what some configuration that we did on tasks, so that whenever the admin configures the task, this is the administration view. And of course, obviously, the initialization, the actual execution. What is the task doing? Okay, so you have to implement both the admin side of it, the setup, what the admin sees, as well as the execution part. This is some example of tasks that we've implemented with custom interfaces for the administrator. So briefly going to the administration tool, you see that you have some available tasks. Again, you can choose to implement the tasks when you create the vault in the administration tool, or you can always add them, import them later. They're available under the install directory in EPDM. This is the add-in that supports the out-of-the-box tasks. If I go down, if I scroll down and I go to the tasks area, you can see that the convert, the design checker, and the print, these are out-of-the-box tasks, basically job server. So let's see if I pick the convert, for example. I'll pick only one of the three out-of-the-box ones. So you can tell that, first of all, it's running based on the out-of-the-box add-in. You have some execution method. You want to run it on a server, what machine, local machine, etc. Menu command, what do you want to see if it's executed manually by a right click? What should the menu show? Certain conversion settings. Do I want it on for all configuration, latest, active? Do I want it to convert the file through old sheets or not? Again, these are all out of the box, basically tasks that are available out of the box. So you can see that there's the certain screens here that SolidWorks came up with for this specific task to convert. And same goes for the print and the design checker. You can pick a target folder and whatnot. Again, these three are available out of the box, very easily configurable, could be configured like I showed. Now, if you need your own task, let's say a more advanced batch printing with job numbers, watermarks, or some batch reporting, yet you still want to use the resources and the way tasks are managed in EPDM, you can write your own custom tasks. We have to comply with certain interfaces. I'm not going to go to that level right now, but if anyone wants to go to that level, then Mark will talk about it a little bit. Not in too details, but we'll talk about it tomorrow. So if I pick my own custom task, just ignore this because I'm running this in debug, you can see that this is an XLM sample task. Notice that some of the tabs are custom tabs. So this is what the admin will see. This is how I build the tasks on the administration side. You can see some custom admin setup that you can write. So you can pretty much say, I want to, whatever, define a target folder location. This is pick a watermark if you want to edit and whatnot. Yet I can still take advantage of some of the built-in tasks functions, such as using the out-of-the-box permissions, using success or failure notification. These are all out of the box. So basically, when I develop the tasks, and again, this is where it gets a little more technical, I have to comply with certain rules and interfaces so that it runs as a task, take advantages of the task resources. I can use some of the out-of-the-box permission mechanisms, success, failure, etc. But at the same time, I can write my own administration side. And of course, this is only the setup portion. I have to develop also the execution part. Actually go get the file, PDF it, watermark it, drop it somewhere, run a report on the database, whatever the task does. So the execution has to be developed as well. Tasks are very useful, but from a cost standpoint, it's like a jump. I would say it's the next step. It's more than an add-in. It's more than a standard executable. So efficient, good, elegant. But if you work with the outside implementer, probably the cost tag is going to go up a little bit. Now, it depends on what the task needs to do, but normally I'd say at least 20% up if you're looking more for a budget and implementation standpoint. Okay, let's see. What else? I think that's all for tasks. The last option, this is the last technical option before we talk about back to implementation consideration and recommendation, is the standalone executable. Standalone executable are used to perform operation outside of the EPDM vault or not related to an event. Basically, it cannot be run as an add-in. You need to run some batch operation. Used to be used a lot more often before tasks came out in 2010, although a lot of customers still prefer doing it because it's cheaper in some cases to execute as standalone and maybe run it as a Windows task than using EPDM tasks. Okay, so still a lot of customers prefer doing batch reporting and whatnot and batch printing using executable instead of EPDM task. Okay, but basically, if you define your own executable, you are not required to comply with any of the technical interfaces that I showed before, like the add-in and the PO. You're on your own. The only thing you need to do is initiate the vault. Log in. There are like 2 or 3 different options to log in, whether you want to prompt the user with a dialog box or not, if you're not already logged in or not, etc. But once you do that, do whatever work you want to do, okay? And it also allows you to possibly take if you want to write the code in a more efficient way and take advantage of more machine power, whatever. Sometimes you cannot do it through tasks. Great. So again, we usually use it either if customer doesn't want tasks because it's too expensive. Normally not that big of a difference, but higher than other options. Or things like migration, where sort of we need to be outside of the system, possibly communicate with more than one system, source and target. We use a lot of migration or integration using either executable, and I'm not going to talk about web services and whatnot. That's kind of a subsection, but that's where we use it. Okay, so when you talk, if you're not a developer, if you talk to your implementer, these are your options. Okay, for the most part. Okay. Let's talk about debugging, testing, and also test environment. Okay, this is a very important environment topic. Unfortunately, oftentimes it's neglected. But technically, if you want to debug an add-in, this is the last technical, really, a little bit more advanced point. But basically, you can. All you have to do is in the administration tool, when you register the add-in first. Let's say this is my add-in. You can basically add an add-in just for debug, which means that it's only going to run on a certain machine for testing. It's not going to break anything else. And then what you have to do in your development environment, make sure that the debug application is Windows Explorer, because basically you all know that EPDM runs in the memory space of Windows Explorer, the namespace of Windows Explorer, extends the namespace of Windows Explorer. So you set it up, you click the start button, and then you can start debugging for those of you who have development skills. You also have to make sure, due to backward history compatibility, that and again, this is all in the slide, just take it step by step, make this COM visible. Okay, EPDM still uses the COM interface. Again, some technical comments, the last comments I have about development. But let's talk about testing in general, because this is more from a planning and system administration. Okay? So you'll be surprised, but it's very important to test functionality. I've worked with more than one administrator. I delivered the code with the set of instructions, highly clarified, strongly recommended to test in your test environment. So the next day he calls me, I put it in production, something doesn't work. Why do you put it in production? Clearly, there was planning, we talked about it. So first of all, don't skip this phase. It's critical. It can break things in the system, can annoy users. So obviously test it first. A lot of users, admins, don't do it. They think they're busy, whatever. Implementer is a good implementer, but no, there's always things that I'm not aware of that the admin might be aware of, and we need to test. Like the example I gave you with the Visio, the title block. I was not aware that there are some non-CAD or non-Visio users in the organization. The admin implemented it, and then those users started getting error a few years back. So that's a good lesson learned for me that I learned the hard way. Obviously, tester will test it, but I'm talking about more from an administrator standpoint. Write various use case and test case scenario. This should not only be a certain group or discipline like engineering. If you have different profiles, at least make sure that you have a quick test for all profiles, whether it's sales, manufacturing, engineering, etc. Now, if it's a quick add-in, it's only going to take you an hour to test all that. It's not a big deal. But go through this checklist and make sure you perform the testing. Obviously, develop the requirements and build a test environment before rolling out, and test environment before rolling out to production. Very important. I recommend having a completely isolated test environment. It doesn't have to be server and powerful server, but could be a decent workstation that you can put SQL, everything on it. Normally, when you test add-in, you test functionality, not performance. In some cases, performance is important, but normally it's not about the performance, it's about the use case, because you're not dealing with huge batch operation. You're handling an ECO or something like that. So try to create a dedicated workstation, preferably not a VM, but if you really have no choice, a VM, run the tests on it. If you absolutely cannot afford or something, which I really can't find a reason for, but you can't afford a workstation even temporarily, add the vault to your production server, but it's a separate vault. So create a vault in EPDM, import the data model, mimic the data model of your production, add some data in test. As soon as you're done, disable or set that vault to offline. Otherwise, it's going to take some resource on your SQL. It's not preferable. It's only if you cannot have an isolated desktop environment. Create another vault in your on your server, production server, test it, mimic, import the data model from your production, test it, and then when you're done, make it offline so it doesn't take resource, doesn't impact your production. Very large application. This is more on the implementer side, but may require unit testing. So if you're doing it in-house, be aware of that. Mainly integration to other system, migration, more complex application, not the typical average add-in, okay? And then last, test across multiple site if application is set. So I would normally say, I would say test it in multiple sites definitely, but also even if it's in one site, make sure you test across more than one machine and across more than one profile. So if you have engineering profile, you have manufacturing, sales, whatever, go through a quick test, even if it takes only 5 minutes per test, go through more than one machine, so you eliminate environment impact, and through more than one profile, okay? Basically, log in is different users, different profiles, and test it. Very important, doesn't take a lot of time. For an average add-in, we're talking about maybe a couple hours. But if you fail to do it, you put it in production. I learned it the hard way. Some admins did it without my knowledge. And then I get a call, we get weird errors, and now the workflow stopped and whatnot. We have to disable the add-in and whatnot. And obviously users are not happy. So don't skip any of these phases, even if, and it's not really involved what I'm talking about here, okay? Now, this is where we get back to discussion. If you remember, we talked about why, when, and what, customizations are. This is, again, going back more to add-in implementation considerations, okay? So when you ask yourself, should I implement an add-in, okay? These are some additional tips to the one I talked about in the earlier slides that will help you make or justify, the decision to customize. If there's any process that that users repeatedly making if users repeatedly making the same mistakes, or certain processes are tedious, you need those extra 2-3 right clicks and drag and drops, and it's really inefficient. Users are complaining. If you want to have one of those mission critical business requirement that we talked about earlier, such as integrating to an ERP, PLM system, migrate data because you have to work with some live data in your system. Again, these are indicators that there's a good chance that you'll need some level of customization, high-end configuration, okay? In this case, it's mainly, we're talking about customization options, add-in, everything we've seen so far. Once you identify that, define not just the functional criteria. I guess I missed the requirement, the functional. And again, it could be a half a page in Word. I'm not saying this is going to be a project, for a basic add-in. We're talking really a couple hours worth of work. Put the requirement and the functions. Obviously, work with your implementer if it's not an in-house one. But make sure it's clearly communicated. We normally use it when we write our contracts or our specs and algorithm. We actually use your requirements. So make sure you don't skip that phase. Define test cases so that when the implementer is done with his work, finishes test labs, you can validate it in your test environment like we talked about in the previous presentation. Build a test environment. We talked about it earlier to ensure that the script will not adversely affect production. And like I said before, recommended to use different hardware, but if it's really not possible, create a new vault in your production server, test it briefly, and then take that vault offline in SQL Server so that it doesn't take or use resources that should be allocated to your production vault. Very important point. If you're the consumer, let's say you work with an implementer, it's not an in-house developer, or even if it's an in-house developer that left the company, I can't tell you how many times, definitely more than 5 or 6 times just in the past couple of years, VARs, customers call me up, can you update something? The VAR, either the person that used to work for the VAR, the reseller is not there anymore. The guy left our company. Okay, what do you need? This is the functionality. Can you change this? Yes. Do you have the code? No. He had it. We never backed it up, whatever. You'll be surprised. I know it sounds ridiculous, but you'll be surprised how many times in the past few years this happened when we had to redevelop something and re-architect simply because you didn't have the source code. So make sure you get it as part of your requirements from your implementer. So this is, to finalize, this is the ROI case. And the next slide, there's an embedded ROI. Oops, I'm sorry by the way, for showing this in a smaller resolution. I didn't pay attention. This is a simple case of an average customization, okay, justifying a customization. So how can we justify an investment? Okay, this is more when we talk about management. It's very difficult to realize the ROI, or you don't know what you don't know. So you need tools to help you justify your colleagues, your management, and whatnot. So let's say we take an average API, the cost of an average API, it's roughly $5,000. Again, it's an average, depends on what the event is, okay? I'm not talking about migration or integration. These are normally more involved. And tasks are also, I'm talking about event-based add-in, roughly an average price, okay? And now, what are the time and cost saving of an automation solution versus developing a script? So let's say you have, in this example, 10 engineers. Engineer cost per hour is roughly, this is based on some study we found on the internet, is like $62.50 roughly. Let's say it saves you 10 minutes a day per engineer. You have 200 days or business days on average in a year. So if you have one engineer, we're talking about $10.42 bucks a day. If it's per year, it's 2,000. So for one engineer, for the first year, might not be that economic. But if you take 10 engineers, or if you multiply by the number of years, you can see that there's a huge return on investment. Okay, so you can quantify it by time and dollar amount. You expand it to multiple years, it's even more. And this is the calculator. It's actually, once you download, it will be available for you from SolidWorks site. Once you download, this is actually an embedded calculator. If you double click on it, it will open a thing in Excel. Again, another example, even a more expensive add-in. This is above average for what a normal add-in. Same thing, same costs. Script saving per day, same calculation. You still, even if it's much higher, you still have a huge ROI in that scenario of 10 engineers, etc. Okay, so this is a great tool sort of to validate, do I really need this? In addition to the fact that there's a tedious process or whatnot that bothers the users. Okay. So in conclusion, customization is a powerful and economical approach to expand and customize EPDM for enterprise PLM needs. There's various options of customization are available. We talked about advanced configuration, like the cards, the different functions, conversions and whatnot. We talked about event-based add-in, based on a change state or a check-in, before and after. Tasks, more like job servers, or executable, your own EXE that you develop to do whatever, integration, migration, reporting, etc. The cost saving and ROI can be significant, like we've seen in these in the examples. Even if we're just talking about 10 minutes, it seems, what's 10 minutes a day? It's not a big deal. But if you go through that exercise of calculating everything in the ROI, you see that it's a huge ROI and an increased efficiency. Even if it's just a matter of 10 minutes a day or less. So with that being said, I'm pretty much done with the presentation. Like I said, we have a booth. If anyone wants to further discuss any of the topics related to your specific implementation, I'm available now or tomorrow at booth 1144. I'll be happy to answer any question if anyone has a question now. If not, I'm pretty much done on my end. No question? Good. Thank you. Thanks.